I know that applying for grants in general can be a really intimidating and overwhelming and often fairly stressful process. So I hope that even if you've done a grant before, hopefully something in this presentation helps you understand the process a little better. And I will admit that sometimes our office, we're in proposals day in and day out. So sometimes we even speak in lingos and acronyms. And so I'll try to kind of explain what a lot of that means today. And if you ever do work with us and we're asking you a question and you're completely confused, I apologize in advance. We are here to help you and make it as easy as we can. So as Hannah mentioned, for this presentation, we're going to be talking about competitive grants specifically. So I know there can be a lot of confusion around contracts versus grants, and we're not necessarily going into how to find grant opportunities today, but if you do need some help with that, I think Hannah's got some great resources, and then both my office and Suzanne Hansford-Bowles, who I think everyone here is pretty familiar with, we both have resources that we can send you to help you even find a grant application that makes sense. Okay, so just to kind of start off what the life cycle of a grant looks like. So my title is Extension Pre-Award Manager, but even if you haven't done a grant before, you may be wondering, what does pre-award even mean? So this is kind of what the typical life cycle looks like everywhere, everything from finding a proposal and developing it all the way to finishing the project and getting it closed out. So when we say pre-award, we're basically talking about everything that's involved before an award is actually set up. So once we get an agreement, it's signed by both parties, we've agreed to do a certain work for a certain amount of money, anything that happens before that, so developing the proposal, actually submitting it to the sponsor, and sometimes there's negotiations after we submit it. They may want to fund us, but they may say, you asked for 500,000, we can only give you 400,000. So then we're reworking our budget, and how does that change our scope of work? So all of that is considered pre-award. And in extension, we have a pre-award team specifically to help with that stage. And then as soon as the award is signed, it kind of gets handed over to our post-award team. So in extension, we've got a few different post-award contacts, and then they're here to help you actually get your award set up and make sure that all of your expenses are posting. One thing I'll mention, as soon as you do find a competitive proposal that you're interested in, definitely be discussing the proposal with your supervisor, with your educational program, regional director. Make sure that they're on board with the application that you're wanting to pursue. And I will also say that there's no cookie cutter proposal either. I've been doing this for years, and very rarely do I see two applications that are the same. So in general, as far as the pre-award, I would probably plan on it taking more time than you may originally think it would take to get us to submission stage. And one of the first things I wanted to talk about is, I know this is a huge question with a lot of our off-campus faculty is, okay, I found a grant proposal that I'm really excited about. Is it better to take that through the university or through my county? And so I will say, I know a lot of, if you have done a grant process before through the university, you will know it can take a little bit more time than going through the county. We definitely have a lot of policies and procedures we have to follow. We have to make sure all approvals are in place. There's a lot of boxes we need to tick. So it can take more time, but I would say that that time is also all those boxes we are ticking can help you and make your proposal as successful as possible. So if it does go through the university, like I said, you have a pre-award team who's helping you make sure that you're meeting all the guideline requirements, that everyone in extension is on board and willing to commit to this work. And then you also have post-award team who's here to help you post your expenses and make sure that all the financial reporting is done correctly and done on time. In a horrible worst case scenario, if we were to get sued because something was done incorrectly, the university would provide the lawyers for that. So you have a lot of resources at your disposal by going through the university. Another big thing to consider is if you're committing any university resources. So the biggest one we see with this is salary and fringe. When a university employee is written into a budget, so if you're saying, okay, I'm the lead PI and I'm going to spend 10% of my time doing this, you just committed a university resource. So if we do include that, then it has to go through the university. So again, when you're making this decision, our team, Suzanne Hansford Bowles, we are both here to help you if you're not sure what would be best for your specific grant. And we will also, again, be encouraging you to work with your directors and your supervisor to make sure that they also are okay with it, whatever route you're choosing to go. Okay, so I mentioned PI in the previous slide. So what does PI actually mean? That is the principal investigator. So the lead PI, which we refer to a lot, it is basically, if you're the PI, this grant is your baby and you are primarily responsible for it throughout that whole life cycle. So you are the one who's taking responsibility in preparing the application and making sure it's submitted. And then as the work is happening, you're the one that the sponsor is looking to make sure that the work that you promised that would be done is getting done, that it's getting done in a timely manner, expenses are posting correctly. So kind of your role once you've found a proposal is let us know as soon as possible, send us the guidelines so we can start looking those over with you. And just kind of get a feel, I would read all the guidelines and kind of get an idea of, okay, what documents are required and what are the ones that you need to start drafting and start developing. If there's a lot of fiscal documents, our office is here to help with those, get those uploaded to the application. But there's a lot that you would need to be starting to prepare as well. So our office is Extension Fiscal. We're in Witten. All of us are on the second floor now, which is very exciting if you didn't hear that at the beginning when I hopped on. So we are here to help you, with getting the whole application together. So we're going through the guidelines with you and we're making sure that you're meeting all the requirements. We also primarily help with budget development, and I'll be getting into that for a few slides. Budgets can be really confusing and there's a lot of different rates, a lot of different things to think about. So we're usually helping develop and finalize the budgets with you as well. Another big thing that our office does is we are the ones who gather an internal approval via a PSRS. So that is a proposal signature routing sheet. And when you do have a proposal that you're interested in, once the budget is finalized and a lot of the key pieces of information are finalized as well, such as your project title and what other collaborators you have, we send out this PSRS and it will need to get approved by you as the PI, by our budget director, by your program director, depending on your title. It could be needed to be approved by your regional director as well. So basically that goes out and we like to give them a few days if we can to look over your proposal and make sure that they do approve it. And then once we have those approvals in place, we send your submission to OSPA. That's our Office of Sponsored Programs Administration. So what I kind of think, so our team in Extension Fiscal, we are really in the weeds with extension proposals specifically. Whereas OSPA kind of has a higher level review and they are looking at all proposals across the University of Missouri. So in Extension, we have a few different contacts at OSPA that we're assigned to on both the pre-award and post-award side. You as the PI probably won't need to communicate with them as much. A lot of times we work as kind of a middleman between, we're working with you as the PI quite a bit in details, getting the proposal together. And then we're also communicating with OSPA to make sure they have lawyers in their office. So they're going to go over any legal language in the guidelines. Sometimes sponsors are wanting us to commit to things just by submitting our application. So they're going to be the ones kind of going over that and making sure that we're okay to submit. So budget. This is a big one. Like I said, this is what my office is primarily here helping you with. When you start thinking, so you probably develop a general scope of work first. When you have a proposal you're looking at and you kind of have an idea of what you want to accomplish. So let's say that you want to provide 10 trainings across the state. You need to kind of think and decide what would it cost for the university to do that training. So time, like I said, is a huge one. You probably, as the PI, but others as well, are probably developing the training, and then the time to travel and then present or administer the training. So that all takes time, and that's a true cost. So we will be going into what the common budget categories are, but just other things to think about is, travel. Like if you had to travel to do a training, then you would typically submit a reimbursement request to the university for mileage. So all of those little details need to be thought about, so that if we do get the scope of work approved, we have already requested that the sponsor cover any costs that will occur. So some of the big things: allowability to think about. Is the cost really necessary for the project? That's a big one. Allocability, that usually refers to, will the sponsor see a direct benefit from that cost being posted to the project and us asking them to reimburse it? Will they understand why it was necessary? And also, if we're buying binders, let's say that's a supply cost that we came up with, we wouldn't charge that same cost to multiple different sponsors. We would cover it once for the project that it's primarily applicable to. So that's kind of allocability to think about. Reasonability, of course, it's saying, are the costs that you included in your budget reasonable? Are there consistent rates? We have a designated mileage rate, for instance, so we would charge that mileage rate regardless of funding source. Or if you have a consultant that that they're going to need to do a piece of the work, we should budget for the rate that they would otherwise charge any other customer to do that same type of work. As you're reviewing the guidelines, definitely be looking, and again, my office is helping with this, but look for any unallowable costs. A lot of times sponsors do have a section in there about items that they specifically will not pay for. So big ones I see as an example is you might have a graduate student on your project, and a lot of sponsors say, that's fine, we're happy to pay for time and medical insurance for your graduate student, but we will not do any tuition reimbursement. So that's something to look at. And amount limitations are also very common. Usually there's both a minimum and a maximum amount that your budget can be. And sometimes it's even specific categories. So they might say, your max budget can be $500,000 and no more than 10% of that can be toward salary. So those are all things to watch out for and just be looking at as you're reading through the guidelines. And okay, shared credit. I wanted to include this because this can be really confusing, and although it's not really related to the budget, it can get confused with the budget. So I wanted to include that in this slide. And kind of to discuss this, we are usually talking about project roles as well. So we've gone over what your role would be as the PI, but oftentimes there are co-PIs who are also involved in the project, and typically, so a co-principal investigator. And typically how we would view them is that they are sharing the responsibility in the project. So even though you're primarily responsible as the PI, they may have a huge role in both having helped you develop the idea. They may have had intellectual contribution, is what we usually say, and even getting the scope of work to where it was to submit to the sponsor, and then also assisting you on the post-award side. And they might take a responsibility for a piece of the project, and sort of then they are the ones that you're relying on to make sure that that work is getting done. So often shared credit is split between PI and co-PIs. And so that needs to be 100% between all of the personnel that it's being distributed between. So let's say that in an easy scenario, you're the PI and you have one co-PI, and you feel like the two of you have been equal in your intellectual contribution to developing the project, and that you will be relying on them very heavily in the post-award side, about half and half, to help you oversee the project. In that case, you may split your shared credit 50-50. So that's different from effort that we include in our budget. So the co-PI may say, okay, I think this project will take 10% of my time. So we include 10% in the budget to cover their effort, but they would still receive 50% of shared credit. So we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And if you do have a specific proposal that you're working on, we can go over this in more detail. But it's something you want to discuss with the people on your project to make sure that they are on board and they think that the way you've distributed shared credit is fair. Another role that you'll hear a lot is key personnel. And so how we typically distinguish them between co-PIs is they may be really important on your project to get the work done, and you may be including them as their effort in the budget, but they don't have a piece of the responsibility. They're not necessarily overseeing it. Sometimes and sometimes not. You can write key personnel into your proposals. You list them by name and their qualifications to help explain to the sponsor why we're qualified to do this work. But often a key personnel can, like, let's say they were to leave by the time this got awarded, you would hopefully be able to find someone else who could kind of fill in and do the work that they were going to do. Whereas co-PIs and PIs are a little bit heavier. They're harder to replace because they're much heavier in their involvement. So that's a really quick difference between shared credit versus effort. And then indirect. This is everyone's favorite topic when it comes to the budget. So you'll also hear this as F&A, which is facility and administrative costs. So what this refers to, if you're brand new and you haven't had the pleasure of discussing indirect before, is these are basically real costs that the university has to perform your project, but there's no way that you could reasonably include those costs in your budget. So a big example is utilities in your office. So let's say you're sitting in your office and that's where you're spending 10% of your time to even develop the training. Well, there's electricity to have your computer and the lights on. And so that is a cost that the university is spending, but there's no way you could say exactly $43.26 of the utility bill should be charged to this exact sponsor. So that's just an example. There's a lot of things that go into this rate. The administrative side refers to time, all of the support that you do have to make sure throughout both pre and post award that everything's being expended correctly. That's all a true cost. So we negotiate rates with the federal government every few years, and basically we come to an agreement with them of what we think a reasonable rate is that helps cover those costs. And so if you're curious, you don't have to remember any of this, but for most extension projects, extension just means that they're not research and they're not for academic credit. Our on-campus rate is 33% and our off-campus rate is 26%. And we'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute and how that actually gets charged. But it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Sometimes guidelines, depending on the source of funds, do restrict indirect. And if they do, we do honor those restrictions. Again, it depends on the source of funds. Because we've negotiated this rate with the federal government, if the sponsor's using federal funds to pay us, they shouldn't really be restricting the rate. There's also something on here, I have MTDC, that's modified total direct costs. Again, nothing you need to memorize. There's basically a list of costs though that the federal government said, that's fine, you can charge 26% on your off-campus projects, but you can't charge F&A at all on any of these types of costs. So equipment, that's a big, and to qualify as equipment instead of supplies, there's a few things that are involved in that. It has to have at least a value of $5,000 and a lifespan of at least a year. So there can be some back and forth conversations between me and the PI trying to make sure that everything is labeled correctly, and then we can make sure our rate's correct. So again, nothing you need to necessarily worry about or remember, but just understanding that there are some costs that will not have indirect applied. Another big term I wanted to talk about is match, also called cost share. And basically that refers to any money that will be contributed to the project, but is not from the sponsor. So it's really common to see match as a requirement in the guidelines. The sponsor might say, you know, we're really excited to give you $500,000 to do this work, but we want you to match dollar for dollar. So if we're giving you $500,000, we expect you are also contributing $500,000. So obviously, match is not something we want to commit to if it's not mandatory, if it's not required in the guidelines. That's always the case, but especially now with the financial hardships that MU is under, we would never want to voluntarily commit costs that we don't have to. So this is definitely a big one to keep in mind, though, as when you find that those guidelines in the very beginning and you're thinking, oh, I think this is a great opportunity, look for cost share and match as one of the first things that you're looking for, so that when you do go to your director or supervisor, you are able to say, okay, hey, we need to match $20,000. Is that reasonable? Is there funds available for me to match to the project? So that's definitely conversations you want to have with them. And then I also included a link to the grant fact sheet. I think Hannah will be sending out the slides after this, so you'll have that link. I definitely recommend bookmarking that and saving it, because even though we will definitely be helping you with your budget, this has a lot of our established rates. It's just a great resource. So all our travel rates, graduate student rates, indirect rates, that's all there and available to you. So it's really helpful. Okay, so really quickly, I put an example of what a budget could look like. This is a fairly simple one. Basically, they wanted to budget for $50,000. So you can see at the bottom, we included, and indirect wasn't restricted. We've decided it's an on-campus project. So 33% was included on top of the direct costs that you went through and decided would be your cost to do the project. So that left budgeting direct costs at $37,594. So I don't want to confuse too much. There could be a whole nother presentation on just how indirect is calculated, but this is one of the first things that we'll be helping you with, because again, we're going to be looking for those modified costs, because that will change how much you have to budget. Sometimes, in this case, we're using our negotiated rate, so that's on top of direct cost, but sometimes, depending on wordings in the guidelines, the sponsor might say we restrict indirect to 10% of the total award. Well, that equates to 11.11% of total direct costs. So we will, from the very beginning, kind of be helping you determine what that is, and then you have your number to work with for direct costs. And a lot of times, if indirect comes out to be more than you expected, or you just completely forgot and you were thinking you had the full $50,000 in direct costs, then oftentimes, sometimes you need to scale back the scope of work. So if you had thought, okay, I can do 10 trainings for $50,000, but now you realize you really have $37,000, you may need to scale that back and present to the sponsor that will be doing 8 trainings instead of 10. So just definitely something to think about. And then salary and fringe, like I said, this is one of the biggest ones to think about when you're beginning, of how much time is it going to take, and who will be spending that time to this project. So in this example, I have the principal investigator. Let's say it's just a simple 1-year project. They think that they will be spending 20% of their effort to this project. And we've decided that over a year, that cost comes out to $14,000. And if it's easier for you to think of effort instead of a percentage as hours worked, you can take the percentage and times that by 40, because a 40-hour work week is what we consider 100% of your effort. If you gave all your effort to one project, that would be 40 hours a week. So you would want to multiply the percentage by 40, and then that will tell you how many hours a week that you would be working. So in this example, 20% times 40 comes out to 8 hours a week, or also you could think of that as 1 full work day. So sometimes if that's a little easier to think about it. And then we also have fringe benefits, which sometimes gets forgotten about. That's all the costs that MU has to employ you in addition to your salary. So fringe benefits covers everything from health insurance to retirement costs and all that good stuff. And we don't go into each individual and see like which plan they use and, you know, if they're like, we basically just use a flat rate, and that's also available on our grant fact sheet. So it changes every year. Sometimes it changes in the middle of the year. So it's really important to bookmark that so that you always have the most up-to-date rate. Right now, our FY21 rate is 35.85%. So we would charge that on top of the salary costs for all full-time employees. And then travel, we have a section for that. Supplies, there's two other big budget categories that are not on this example, and that would be contractual. So if you have any consultants that will be helping you or subcontracts, and we will also quickly touch on what the difference between those are. That would be a contractual category. And then we also have a other category. So that will kind of lump into anything that does not fit in one of these other categories. So when we were discussing match, I forgot to touch on this, but sometimes a sponsor wants cash match, and that would come from the university. But other times you could have third parties include match. So another organization has money and they want to give that to you. That's awesome. There's also something called in-kind match, and that's basically goods or services that are provided in place of cash but have a monetary value. So that's important to not, again, every application is different. So a sponsor may require match but restrict in-kind. So that's something we'll be looking for. But let's say, as an example, you needed to rent a room to do your training, and a hotel was willing to give you a room for free because they really like your project. We have got a strong partnership. But if they would typically charge that room, let's say $50 an hour, and you needed it for 5 hours, then they would say they're providing the room, but it would have a monetary value of a certain amount. So back to this budget example, something like that, a room rental doesn't really fit in travel or contractual or supplies. So we would lump that all under other. But these are basically the things that you want to be thinking about. Travel's a big one. You know, I put on this example 2 different types of travel. That's even easier for you to think about. Let's say in-state, people will need to be traveling together to do a focus group, but what if you had a conference that just you and the co-PI were going to that's out of state? Those are going to have additional costs. So special circumstances. So the primary point of this slide is to remind you that there can be things in the guidelines that can make a proposal take a significant amount of time. Like I said, probably more time than you would expect or want a proposal to take. The first one on this list is a limited submission opportunity. We see quite a bit of this. This is where the guidelines say, you know, we only want to see 1 application per applicant or per organization. And so what that means for us, depending on what their wording is and what they're looking at, that could be only 1 on behalf of the University of Missouri, or it could be just 1 application on behalf of the whole system. So basically we have an internal process that OSPA hosts, and you basically need to go through an internal competitive process to even get to be the 1 PI who can submit their application to the sponsor. So obviously that additional competition, that takes a lot of time. Inclusion of subcontracts. So kind of back to how this differs from consultants. The reason subcontracts can take so much time is because they are very significant to the project and they are developing work and a budget specifically for this project. So you are really relying heavily on them to, let's say, maybe do 25% of the work. And so they're actually going to receive 25% of the funds that we are getting from the sponsor. So whereas a consultant is, you know, just hopefully has a flat fee or a flat rate that they would charge a variety of customers for the same amount of work, that doesn't really take that much time. Subcontracts, they need to be working with you to develop their own budget and their own budget narrative. And so usually both the PI and then my office is working with that sub to say, here's all the documents we need from you. There's typically a letter of commitment, and depending on the guidelines, there's really specific things that need to be included in that letter. So not only will we be asking our sub for that, but then once they send it to us, we're going to be reviewing to make sure it does meet the guidelines. So that can take an additional bit of time. In a perfect world, I usually try to give our subs a 2-week deadline before our proposal is due. So we have plenty of time to finalize everything and make sure that their documents are correct. So I won't go into each of these specifically. Basically, again, just keep in mind, look out for things that will take more time. Or do we need to submit through an online portal? And if so, do you need to set up an account? Sometimes on certain federal websites, if the PI needs an account, that can take quite a bit of time to even go through the system. If they require a hard copy of your application, which I wish didn't happen, but it does. Let's say the deadline is 5 p.m. on a Friday. Well, if they need a hard copy in hand by 5 p.m. on a Friday, that means the latest we can submit is the day before, and we can overnight our application. So again, just lots of things to think about. So the proposal submission, let's say, okay, now we've developed our proposal, the application's ready to go, all the approvals are in place. Now what? So the PI, we do ask for at least a draft of the application, at least 10 business days prior to the deadline, which I know can sound like a lot of time, but it takes a lot. I would say it takes at least a week usually for us to go back and forth discussing the budget, making sure we've made all the requirements, the application's good to go. There's a lot of times, like I said, there's no cookie cutter proposals. And so a few months ago, I found one that was a foundation that wanted a conflict of interest disclosure form. And so we had to list anyone in UM's system who could potentially have a conflict with this organization, not just the PI. So that took quite a bit of time to work with the conflict of interest office and OSPA and making sure. I'd never seen that form before and they hadn't either. So sometimes those types of documents can take quite a bit of time. And we also ask for 10 business days because OSPA asks that my office send the application at least 5 business days ahead of time. This is because OSPA is the one who will actually submit your application for you on behalf of the university. And they are basically the last set of eyes to make sure that our application has everything that it needs. So, you know, you have a full-time job outside of applying for this proposal. Often my office can be looking at a dozen different proposals at a time. So things do get missed, especially a lot of the federal grants. Guidelines can be 200 pages long. So that's why we really rely on OSPA and want to give them adequate time to review, because they're that third set of eyes, which is really helpful. And they often catch things that both you and I may have missed. So they do a final review, they make sure all internal approvals are in place, and then they are the one who will actually sign any documents on behalf of the university and will officially submit. So I won't go into this too much. I want to leave time for Q&A, but if in a happy world you submitted your proposal and 6 months later the sponsor awards us, like I said, sometimes that negotiation process can take quite a while. Either they want budget revisions, or sometimes that can get really held up in legal. Let's say they send us an award and it has a lot of legal language, terms and conditions that our university doesn't want to be liable for, then that's OSPA negotiating with the sponsor. So you will not, as the PI, ever have to negotiate with the sponsor. You're working with my office, we're both working with OSPA. But then eventually, when everything's finalized and we've signed a contract, you would get something that we call a GAS. It's a grant award summary. And so that would be emailed to you with a MO code. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with MO codes, but accounts, it's basically an account that now any expense you have, whether it's a travel reimbursement or a supply that someone's ordering for you, that will get charged to that specific MO code. And then basically everything that happens after this can be a whole separate post-award training as far as, you know, what my office does to set up expenses. So that salary, we set that up for you, and then actually helping you manage your project all the way through. So That's basically, in a really quick nutshell, pre-award and the details of budgeting specifically. So does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Alysha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot of information.
Yeah. I'm like, oh yeah, I know this stuff now. I've learned.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions. So you talked mostly about the process of doing a grant through campus, but it's also possible to do it through the local county office. Can you just explain a little bit more, like when it might be better to do a local county office, or what
Yeah.
the different types?
Let me get back to that.
Yeah, just a bit more about the local process.
So basically, when you're making this decision, and one reason that we wouldn't necessarily go into a whole lot of details of taking it through the county is because if you do decide to go that route, that's not something my office or OSPA is involved in at all. So we're not really helping the PIs go through that because it's not on behalf of the university. So I think it's just key to make sure that you are working with your local leaders, with the county council, so that they are involved, and also that you make sure that they're supportive of the application. But I think, yeah, the biggest thing to think about when you're making that decision is capacity. If it is a large budget, even if you don't have any university resources in it, that can be a lot to track and a lot to manage. And I think sometimes the county offices wouldn't necessarily have the resources in place to track as much as needed, especially when the agreements come in. And like I said, sometimes those can be many pages long that our university lawyers are going through and negotiating. They're saying, no, this is, a lot of times sponsors, for instance, want like very detailed, like hourly, instead of just saying they work 5% of their time, they want like a timesheet. That's something that we can agree to if the PI is willing to do that extra step, but it's not something the university does. We don't require our employees to fill out a timesheet per hour of what they're working on. So that's an extra burden. And if there's a lot of extra requirements and financial reports that the sponsor is asking for, sometimes the county just doesn't have the reasonable capacity or time available to help you with that project and make sure that that's all getting done. So again, my office and Suzanne can help you. We can, if you're looking at a proposal, we can look at it with you and see if we think it makes sense to go through the county. I would say most of the ones that I see that go through the county have pretty small budgets. They're pretty tiny, and they have very minimal terms and conditions that they're agreeing to, just to make sure that they do have that capacity. Is that helpful?
I think so.
If you ever have any specific questions, send them to us and we will help you.
Kind of related to that, Joe had a comment that he had a small grant that had match from the city, but then the city reneged their match later on. And he hadn't thought about having like a match requirement, like having them sign anything, but thinks he should now. So just any other thoughts on match and...
Yeah, and that's one of the things I kind of forgot to touch on and backtracked on when I was talking about the budget, but the different types of match. So it sounds like in that case, he had a third party who had agreed to contribute some match so that the university wasn't providing all of that cash. So if it's going through the university, we do require actually a letter of commitment. And it's usually pretty specific. They say, we're supportive of this project that this PI is leading during this time frame. And during this period of performance, we are agreeing to commit to $5,000. So before we even send out that PSRS for internal approvals, we will be saying, this amount of match is required, but the university only needs to match this much. And then here's the letters of commitment of why we feel pretty secure in that. If in the event that we didn't have a letter or, let's say we didn't have a letter of commitment, we can get approvals internally. If you said, I really think that this organization will match, I have every reason to believe that they will, but we don't have a commitment in hand, then in order for OSPA to send it out, we will actually need approvals from Extension. That's going to be your program director, the budget director, with a backup MO code that can pay for those expenses in the event that we don't get that third party match. So if you don't have the letter of commitments, I mean, it's going to be hard to get it through the university that way. If it's going through the county, I would definitely make sure that you have a backup plan. If the match doesn't come through, that you have an account that could pay those expenses, because the sponsor doesn't care. If we said we will match 50,000, they expect 50,000, whether it's coming from us or not. So.
Yeah, thanks. Another question, it says, effort was explained, but could you give a bit more detail about credit and what the credit is about?
Yeah, the shared credit. So yeah, I think I might have kind of missed explaining what the credit's actually used for. So I think I talked a little bit about distributing it and how that's decided. But essentially, so under the new resource allocation model, colleges and departments, so that indirect that we had listed, that's those, any direct, like that covers all the costs of the university that you can't directly tie to the project. So under the new allocation model, colleges and departments will be getting a piece of that indirect back, because a lot of those expenses are on the colleges and departments that indirect is covering. The department's the one paying for that. So basically the campus is saying, okay, if we had 26% included in your project, they will take a piece of that, and we don't know exactly what those percentages are right now. And then a big piece of that goes back to your college, your region, your department. They will, don't want to get too much in the details, but basically campus will give it to extension, and then our budget director decides how that's divvied out among the departments depending on what projects were awarded and where those departments were housed. So a big reason why shared credit is so important is because when we are submitting that PSRS, we basically assign a debt ID. It's an account that will go back to your department. So we're basically saying, let's say that the lead PI was community development and their co-PI was in HES. Then if you split the shared credit 50-50, we're saying, okay, 50% of what does get to come back cash-wise for this project, 50% of that gets to go to community development and 50% of that goes to HES. And that's a really quick overview. There can be a lot of different things that go into how it's distributed. It's not always as easy as 100% of your credit goes to your home department, but that's kind of something that my office worries about as far as making sure that the correct accounts are in. But that's kind of a good overview of why it's important, and why if you're a co-PI on a project, you want to make sure, discuss that with your PI and say, I think I'm contributing quite a bit, and how are you thinking of distributing credit? And then have a conversation about what's fair. So that the direct money that comes back isn't as important when indirect's completely restricted and 0% is on there, but it's also used for reporting. So your supervisors and the directors do look at reports that see who's been listed on grants and how much credit did they receive. That's basically their way of knowing how involved you were in those projects. So it's definitely something to talk about and think about quite a bit. And again, my office will be asking the PI what the shared credit distribution is. And so if you're ever not sure or you would like to discuss that further, we're happy to look at your specific project and talk about it with you and see what makes sense.
Anyone else have any other questions? So for now, I have just one or two kind of smaller ones that are helpful to think about.
Yeah.
You said your office needs at least 10 days ahead of time before the proposal. What would
Well, we asked for that.
Well, you asked for 10 days.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've never had one give it to you right before. Not our office.
Right, never.
But are there any general guidelines, and other people that have written grants can chime in to the discussion, but what's a good amount of time to give yourself to write a proposal and get it submitted? If you have any thoughts on that, or anyone else, I just think that might be something helpful to know if you've never done a grant application before.
Yeah. I mean, if anyone wants to chime in, feel free. I definitely would just stress to lean on as much time as possible. If you find some guidelines that you're interested in applying for and there's only a week left, it may be possible that you can get it done in time and that we can work on getting those approvals in place and getting things submitted. But I would say the most successful proposals that I see go out are the ones that have more time, where you're not feeling rushed and all parties aren't stressed. You know, you definitely want to give that week to OSPA to review, if at all possible. Because like I said, they are the ones, if we don't give them time to check to make sure everything's in place, you've lost that advantage for your proposal. And it definitely can take quite a bit of time. I didn't go into writing the narrative as much here because our office is a little heavier in the budget assistance. Suzanne Hansford Bowles, she's not a grant writer, but she was in the past. And so she has helped when she has time, sort of looking over project narratives and giving feedback. Depending on the size and scope of the project, it is a possibility, if your director approves, to hire a grant writer to help you. But even when that happens, that's usually at least a month out from the proposal that we're then hiring that person and working on the collaborating of writing. So I don't know, I would say the more time you can allow yourself, the better.
I'll jump in on that. Oh,
yeah, both Sarah and Pat, go ahead.
I was just gonna jump in and say, for example, that Ag Innovation Center grant that Alysha and Hannah and I worked on together, we worked on that for 6 months. The RFP came out and I literally worked on it for 6 months before submitting it. Again, that's a $1.5 million grant, right? So you can, if the more time you have, the better you can make it. But one piece of advice I might give to everyone, especially if you're new, if you have an idea, like say you have an idea for a program, but you haven't identified a funding source, write down the narrative for that idea, get feedback from your regional director, get feedback from your educational director, keep a drawer full of ideas in your desk or on your hard drive, you know, so to speak, in your desk. And that way you can react. Sometimes these RFPs will come out and have a really quick turnaround. Mm-hmm. Like I did one recently for Kauffman Foundation. It was really quick. If you didn't already have something ready to go in your desk drawer, you wouldn't make it. So that's what I would encourage folks, is to start writing down those ideas. If you're in a good creative mood and you're in a mood to do some writing, take advantage of that, write things down, and then that way it's ready to go when an RFP pops up.
And this is Trish Barrett. I would also like to comment that never assume that it'll be perfect the first time and that OSPA will just process it through. Those relationships are extremely important, and you need to keep in communication, not only with your office, Alysha, but also with your upper level education directors, because if they don't sign off on it, you know, you just wasted all your time. And again, it's important to put together a crack team that your education directors see as producers. So I just wanted to share that, because I've gone through back and forth multiple versions of grants, you know, that we know have a 3-year time period, but you have to resubmit every year. Well, that's good, but you also have to realize that other people might be competing for those funds. And so I just wanted to share that, because other people on campus might be writing that same grant. And am I correct, Alysha, that is it OSPA that decides finally which program to sponsor?
You mean when it's a limited submission?
Yes, yes, exactly.
So OSPA sort of has the control over that internal competition. They're not the ones who decide. They find experts in your field to review all the applications. And then they kind of rely on their advice as far as which application is what they think would be the most successful. So yeah, OSPA is the one who would be announcing the competition and then communicating with us and the PI as to if you were invited to submit or not. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely, the rate of successful proposals is not as high as, you know, just from the nation for anyone who's applying for proposals. They only have so much funds. So kind of back to Sarah's point of having things in your drawer that are ready to go, not only is that helpful for if you do have a short turnaround time, but a lot of applications, they repost those programs every year. So if you weren't successful, a lot of sponsors will provide feedback if you didn't get funded. So whether if they are, that's awesome. If they don't, you know, then you have a year to kind of tweak it and kind of rethink what would make it stronger. And then you have that in your arsenal the next time that application comes around. So just because you don't get funded, I would definitely, you know, keep those still in mind, and you can still apply next year. So.
This is Connie Burnham. A couple examples of what you've been talking about in terms of getting ideas and, you know, thinking through and kind of putting them into a box so that when, you know, something comes along, you know, again, there's going to be grants that are going to be offered every year. We just went through that, a few of us, and it was on disaster resiliency, which is a huge issue right now. And and there's more and more grants that are coming out, and there'll be more grants through the years. And we were trying to, you know, pull something together. Well, when you're talking about a National Science Foundation grant, and you know, they'll narrow it down to 12 applications, and, you know, it's $1 million. I mean, you know, that you know, there's some work that has to be done, and just trying to even get the concept together, to get a budget together and that sort of thing, to even pass it on to anybody else, I said, you know, was almost impossible for us to be able to do. So I said, well, let's just step back. Let's form a group. And if we want to work on it together, then we can work on it and put some ideas together so that when this sort of opportunity comes along next year, we are much better prepared. So I completely agree with what Sarah was saying. That you know, is a great idea. One that we just learned ourselves, you know, by going through a process ourselves. But, you know, when we were working on a state farm grant, and Suzanne and Christine Montgomery from Advancement, they were instrumental in getting the right verbiage there. You know, I think I can pretty much answer the questions that they're asking in a proposal. And, you know, you take information that you've already, you know, written about other things, and you put it in there. And then you find out, you know, that really maybe it's not answering the question. So having somebody else looking over and helping you with that narrative, I think, is vitally important. If you do not do that, you're missing out, because you might miss out on a grant just because of that. So Suzanne was just, and Christine both, you know, they offered all kinds of feedback and said, you know, and they're just good writers. And so, you know, it was really, really helpful to me. So anyway, take advantage of them whenever you can.
Thanks, Connie. I think that's a good tip too, right? Like being collaborative when doing grants. I mean, you'll have the key personnel and other people on grant, but we're a large team, and maybe sending it to another CES to review and read through and give comments. I think that's a good tip as well, just getting as many perspectives as possible to strengthen the application. All right, we got 3 minutes left. If there's one final question from anyone before we wrap up. Joe?
I just think sometimes, especially for the new ones, just because you don't get something the first time, you may want to resubmit it. I know several years ago, our courthouse looked into a grant, and my wife and the presiding commissioner wrote it. They didn't. I told them they also needed to talk to the state senator and representative to get a little support. They chose not to do that. And when they didn't get it, they were told by DNR to redo it or send it in the next year, and they didn't do that because they just gave up because they didn't get it the first time. And I don't think you ought to do that.